In the 16th century, the Hausa city-state of Zazzau stood at a crossroads between trade and vulnerability. Surrounded by rival states and positioned along valuable commercial routes, it possessed opportunity but lacked dominance. Into this environment was born Amina, a royal daughter raised within a political system where authority was traditionally male and expansion was cautious. Her early life unfolded not in isolation, but within a kingdom aware of its limits. The dry season winds moved across the savannah with a steady persistence, carrying fine dust that settled into walls, into fabric, into the grain of carved doors. Zazzau stood within that landscape not as an empire but as a participant in a larger web of exchange. Caravans passed through its markets bearing salt from the north and goods from forested regions to the south, and the city's prosperity depended on access rather than dominance. Its rulers understood this balance. Trade required stability, stability required defense, defense required negotiation as much as force. Strength was measured carefully, never squandered. The city itself rose behind earthen walls shaped by labor and repair. These fortifications were not symbols of conquest but of caution. Beyond them stretched farmland sustained by seasonal rains and vulnerable to disruption. Rival Hausa states maintained their own ambitions, each calculating alliances and disputes with attention to trade corridors that could shift wealth in a single season. Authority in this region was diffuse, negotiated through tribute, kinship, and reputation. Zazzau could not afford reckless expansion. Its position demanded vigilance. Within the royal compound, hierarchy was visible in daily routine. Courtyards opened into chambers where advisors gathered to consider grain stores, caravan levies, and border reports. Power rested not solely in the person of the ruler but within councils that preserved continuity. Into this structure Amina was born, the daughter of royal lineage, raised among protocols that shaped posture and speech. From an early age she would have observed the rhythms of governance, messengers arriving at dusk, disputes settled before sunrise, the careful distribution of authority among titled officials. Her upbringing unfolded within expectations that were neither indulgent nor detached. Royal daughters were symbols of alliance and continuity, their marriages capable of securing peace or strengthening ties. Yet proximity to power also meant exposure to its burdens. Decisions carried consequences visible in the fields outside the walls. A failed negotiation could mean lost caravans, a delayed harvest could strain loyalty. Even within comfort, the fragility of security was apparent. The broader Hausa world in which Zazzau operated was defined by competition led atop cooperation. Shared language and cultural structures did not eliminate rivalry. Instead, they intensified awareness of comparative strength. Neighboring states fortified their own positions, sometimes clashing over tribute or territory, other times aligning temporarily against external threats. News traveled along trade routes as reliably as goods. Amina would have grown up hearing of campaigns conducted elsewhere, of rulers who extended influence beyond traditional borders, of others who faltered under strain. In such an environment, military capacity was not an abstract virtue but a visible necessity. Cavalry units required maintenance, horses demanded resources, and trained retainers needed loyalty reinforced through reward. War was costly, but vulnerability was more so. Zazzau's leadership maintained a posture of measured defense, neither aggressively expansionist nor passive. It was a balance born of geography. Positioned along valuable corridors yet surrounded by capable rivals, the city-state existed in a state of alert calculation. Amina's early exposure to these realities shaped her perception of authority. She would have seen that power was sustained through movement, caravans arriving, envoys departing, patrols circulating along the perimeter. Stasis invited decline. Even moments of apparent calm were underwritten by preparation. Within the royal court, discussions of tribute and border tensions were routine, spoken in steady tones rather than alarm. Governance demanded composure. The landscape beyond the walls reinforced this discipline. During dry months, the earth hardened and travel became easier, yet water scarcity increased strain. During rains, fields revived but roads turned uncertain. Seasonal change dictated strategy. Leaders who failed to account for climate paid in weakened defenses or interrupted trade. Such constraints fostered prudence. Zazzau's rulers learned to think in cycles rather than impulses. By the time Amina reached maturity, the regional balance of power was neither fixed nor secure. Subtle shifts in trade patterns could alter influence. Ambitious neighbors probed for weakness. Internal succession always carried risk. The kingdom's caution had preserved it, but caution also imposed limits. Expansion remained restrained, framed as risk rather than opportunity. Within this atmosphere of controlled tension, Amina's formative years unfolded. She did not grow up in a realm of unchecked grandeur but within a polity acutely aware of its boundaries. The lessons available to her were practical. Authority required vigilance, prosperity required protection, and survival depended on anticipating change before it arrived. Zazzau stood balanced between potential and constraint, its future shaped by choices yet to be made. Unlike many royal heirs, Amina's education extended beyond courtly rituals into military organization and territorial awareness. As neighboring states consolidated power and competed for trade influence, Zazzau's survival increasingly depended on strategic strength. Amina observed these pressures closely, understanding that defense alone would eventually invite encirclement. The foundations of her future campaigns were laid not in rebellion, but in analysis. Within the courtyards of the royal compound, instruction was rarely confined to ceremony. While formal lessons in lineage, diplomacy, and governance shaped her public bearing, the rhythms of the city exposed her to matters less ornamental. Messengers arrived with reports of caravan delays caused by border disputes. Traders spoke of new levies imposed by rival rulers along key corridors. Each account carried implications measured not only in coin but in influence. These fragments of information formed a quiet education, accumulating over seasons. Military presence in Zazzau was neither theatrical nor distant. Cavalry units trained beyond the walls, their horses kicking dry earth into the air as riders practiced formation and maneuver. The discipline required to maintain such forces was visible in routine: saddles inspected, bridles repaired, blades honed against stone. Amina's exposure to this discipline did not occur through spectacle but through proximity. She observed how readiness demanded repetition, and how authority over armed men required more than inheritance. It required competence recognized by those who bore risk. The political geography of the Hausa states reinforced the necessity of such competence. Neighboring polities expanded their influence gradually, securing tributary relationships that extended economic reach. Consolidation did not always arrive through open battle, it emerged through negotiated dominance, reinforced by credible force. Reports of these developments circulated through traders and envoys. Amina would have understood that power was shifting in increments, not in sudden upheaval. Her education therefore absorbed elements of calculation. Court discussions of tribute were inseparable from discussions of defense. Grain stores were assessed alongside cavalry strength. The boundaries between economic and military strategy blurred in practice. If caravans altered their routes to avoid perceived instability, revenue diminished. If revenue diminished, military maintenance suffered. The cycle was clear enough to those attentive to it. Participation in military observation likely demanded restraint. Amina's position as a royal daughter did not automatically grant command, yet it did allow presence. Standing at the edge of training grounds, she would have seen the strain in a rider's posture after prolonged drills, the coordination required to move as a unified unit rather than scattered individuals. These were not romantic images but functional realities. Effectiveness depended on endurance. Seasonal rhythms further sharpened awareness. Dry months enabled longer patrols but strained water supplies. Rains replenished fields yet complicated mobility. Planning had to account for climate, terrain, and supply. To treat military matters as isolated from environment would have been impractical. The land itself dictated tempo. Amina's understanding of strategy matured within these constraints, shaped by observation rather than abstraction. The internal politics of succession also contributed to her analytical formation. Royal households were rarely insulated from tension. Authority required affirmation through alliances within the court as much as through force beyond it. Watching negotiations unfold, she would have perceived that stability rested on perception of strength. A ruler perceived as hesitant invited testing. A ruler perceived as decisive deterred opportunism. Such lessons did not need to be spoken explicitly to be absorbed. Gradually, patterns emerged. Defensive posture preserved territory but rarely expanded influence. Neighboring states that extended control over trade arteries gained leverage that defensive states lacked. To remain reactive was to allow others to shape the regional balance. Amina's exposure to these dynamics did not produce impulsive ambition. Instead, it fostered recognition that survival and growth were intertwined. Physical training likely accompanied intellectual formation. Competence in horsemanship and weapon handling was practical knowledge within ruling families. The feel of reins tightening under pressure, the controlled weight of a blade balanced in hand, these experiences connected theory to sensation. Strategy ceased to be an abstract concept and became embodied discipline. Such embodiment reinforced seriousness. Command required credibility, and credibility was rooted in demonstrated capability. Over time, observation coalesced into perspective. Zazzau's caution had preserved it, but caution alone could not guarantee permanence in a shifting landscape. The consolidation of neighboring powers signaled a narrowing margin for passivity. Amina's awareness of this narrowing margin did not manifest as open defiance of tradition. It matured quietly, within the structures she inhabited. She learned to read reports not as isolated events but as indicators of trajectory. By the end of her formative years, the elements of a military mind were present: attentiveness to supply, sensitivity to geography, understanding of morale, and recognition of timing. None of these qualities emerged dramatically. They accumulated through exposure to constraint and opportunity alike. Zazzau's position demanded vigilance, and vigilance required interpretation. In learning to interpret the pressures surrounding her kingdom, Amina prepared herself not for spectacle, but for responsibility shaped by necessity. Upon assuming power, Amina did not immediately disrupt the political order. Instead, she gradually reorganized military priorities, strengthening cavalry forces and reinforcing strategic positions. What began as border security evolved into calculated expansion. Campaigns extended outward, not as reckless conquest, but as structured assertions of authority over trade corridors and tributary territories. Zazzau's posture shifted from reactive to assertive. Her accession did not arrive in a moment of spectacle. Authority transferred through established channels of recognition, affirmed within the court before it was felt beyond the walls. The early months of her rule were marked by continuity rather than declaration. Tribute was collected according to precedent, markets operated without interruption, and patrols followed familiar routes along vulnerable edges of territory. Stability, carefully maintained, signaled reassurance to allies and caution to rivals. Yet beneath this surface steadiness, adjustments began. Cavalry inspections grew more frequent. Horses were assessed not only for readiness but for endurance over longer distances. Supply depots near frontier settlements were inventoried with new precision. These were incremental changes, subtle enough to avoid provoking alarm, yet deliberate in their direction. Defensive preparation became forward planning. Reports from caravan leaders continued to shape policy. Some routes had begun to drift toward territories offering greater guarantees of protection. Influence followed security. Amina's council examined these patterns not as isolated grievances but as indicators of regional recalibration. Trade corridors were arteries of wealth. To lose proximity to them was to diminish leverage. Protection alone would not secure advantage. Presence would. The first outward movements were framed as reinforcement of vulnerable border communities. Patrols extended their range under the justification of deterring raids. Where resistance emerged, it was addressed decisively but without prolonged engagement. These operations were limited in scale, designed to test response and measure terrain. Officers returned with detailed accounts of water sources, defensible ridges, and settlements inclined toward accommodation rather than confrontation. Administrative planning accompanied these expeditions. Tribute agreements were drafted in anticipation of compliance. Authority was asserted not solely through arms but through structure. Local leaders were permitted to retain positions under acknowledgement of Zazzau's primacy. Such arrangements reduced the necessity of continuous occupation while extending influence beyond formal boundaries. Expansion did not initially resemble conquest, it resembled integration. Within the capital, awareness of change accumulated gradually. Markets reflected subtle shifts as caravans recalibrated their routes to account for new security assurances. Envoys from neighboring polities arrived more frequently, seeking clarification of intent. Amina's responses remained measured. She avoided declarations of dominance, allowing actions to communicate posture. Strength was displayed through consistency rather than proclamation. The physical demands of extended patrol reinforced seriousness. Riders traversed dry plains where heat distorted the horizon and water skins lightened quickly. Equipment bore the strain of distance. These realities imposed limits that required calculation. Expansion could not exceed supply. Campaign seasons were aligned with climate to preserve endurance. Planning accounted for fatigue as much as for resistance. As successive operations secured footholds along key corridors, Zazzau's strategic horizon widened. What had been considered frontier gradually became interior. Defensive lines shifted outward. Settlements once peripheral became connective nodes in a growing network of allegiance. Each addition increased both opportunity and obligation. New territories required oversight, arbitration, and the promise of protection fulfilled consistently. Opposition did not disappear, but it adapted. Some neighboring states probed cautiously, testing whether Zazzau's outward posture signaled vulnerability at home. These probes were met with disciplined response. Retaliation remained proportionate, avoiding overextension while reinforcing credibility. Reputation hardened through repetition. Reliability became a form of deterrence. Within the court, discourse reflected this transformation. Discussions once dominated by maintenance of balance now addressed management of growth. Revenue increased incrementally, permitting reinforcement of cavalry numbers and fortification of key transit points. The logic of expansion began to sustain itself. Greater reach produced greater resources, which in turn supported further reach. The cycle, once defensive, became expansive. Amina's authority matured alongside this shift. Command decisions were informed by accumulated reports and demonstrated outcomes. Confidence did not manifest as excess, but as clarity. Strategic priorities were articulated with reference to terrain, supply, and precedent. Those who served under her observed consistency in direction. Expansion was not erratic, it followed discernible lines of advantage. Over time, the distinction between protection and assertion blurred. Control of trade corridors implied influence over neighboring settlements. Tribute acknowledged primacy. Zazzau's presence in regions once considered external altered regional calculations. Other rulers now weighed their own policies in response to this emerging force. The balance that had once constrained Zazzau began to adjust around it. By the close of this phase, the kingdom's posture had undeniably changed. The walls of the capital remained, but their symbolic meaning shifted. They no longer marked the limits of ambition, only the center of administration. Expansion had proceeded through analysis, discipline, and measured assertion. Zazzau was no longer defined solely by the need to defend. It had begun to shape the space beyond its borders through sustained, deliberate advance. As military expeditions intensified, neighboring polities were drawn into Zazzau's expanding sphere. Fortified walls, later remembered in oral traditions, marked not only territorial boundaries but political intention. Expansion required administration as much as force, and tribute systems reinforced Zazzau's reach. The transformation was no longer temporary. The state itself was being redefined through sustained outward pressure. The rhythm of campaign seasons settled into a pattern that reshaped expectation. Riders departed at the close of harvest, when provisions could be secured without straining local stores, and returned before the rains rendered distant routes uncertain. What had begun as probing movements along contested corridors became sustained presence. Settlements once peripheral to Zazzau's concerns were incorporated into its calculations. Authority traveled with cavalry columns, but it lingered in the form of envoys, scribes, and appointed intermediaries. The construction of defensive walls in newly aligned territories carried layered meaning. Earth was cut and shaped by coordinated labor, forming barriers that mirrored the capital's own fortifications. These walls were not only instruments of protection, they were statements of permanence. To raise them required resources and cooperation. Their presence signaled that Zazzau did not intend to withdraw after a single campaign season. Political alignment was reinforced by physical alteration of landscape. Administration followed assertion. Tribute agreements were formalized with greater regularity, calibrated to local capacity while affirming hierarchy. In some regions, tribute consisted of goods tied to trade networks. In others, it involved provision of mounted auxiliaries or access to grazing grounds. The system demanded oversight. Messengers moved between territories carrying sealed directives and returning with reports of compliance. Revenue increased incrementally, enabling reinforcement of cavalry units and maintenance of extended patrol routes. Within the capital, governance expanded to accommodate growth. Councils now addressed disputes arising from distant settlements. Grain levies were adjusted to account for newly integrated lands. The burden of expansion became visible in paperwork, in deliberation, in the quiet extension of responsibility. Conquest did not conclude at the battlefield, it continued in arbitration chambers where local grievances required adjudication under a broader authority. Resistance, when it emerged, tended to reflect calculation rather than impulse. Some leaders tested the limits of Zazzau's oversight, withholding tribute or shifting allegiance temporarily. Responses were measured. Rapid deployment of cavalry reasserted presence without prolonged occupation. The objective was stability rather than devastation. Excessive destruction would erode the very networks expansion sought to secure. Discipline in retaliation preserved credibility. The physical toll of sustained campaigns accumulated. Riders bore the strain of distance etched into posture and gait. Equipment required constant repair. Horses, vital to mobility, demanded careful rotation to prevent exhaustion. Logistics became as critical as valor. Supply depots positioned along secured routes reduced vulnerability to interruption. Expansion required infrastructure as much as initiative. As territories consolidated under Zazzau's influence, patterns of trade began to reorient. Caravans adjusted routes to pass through fortified nodes aligned with Amina's authority. Market exchanges reflected the assurance of protection. Wealth circulated with greater predictability, reinforcing administrative capacity. The economic dimension of expansion validated its strategic logic. Authority now carried tangible reward. Psychologically, consolidation altered perception within and beyond Zazzau. Subjects accustomed to defensive caution observed the normalization of outward movement. Successive seasons without major reversal fostered confidence grounded in repetition. For neighboring states, the calculus shifted. Zazzau was no longer a state guarding its margins but a presence shaping the margins of others. Diplomacy grew more complex, informed by recognition of sustained reach. The fortifications erected in aligned territories created a visual continuity that extended the capital's identity outward. Travelers approaching these walls encountered architectural echoes of the center, reinforcing association. Political intention was embedded in earth and labor. Such markers reduced ambiguity regarding allegiance. Territory became legible through structure. With each cycle of consolidation, administrative demands deepened. Tribute collection required accurate accounting. Disputes between local authorities and appointed representatives necessitated mediation. Governance extended across distance through trusted officials whose loyalty required cultivation. Expansion thus multiplied responsibility. The state's identity evolved from cautious participant to organizing force. Amina's role within this transformation reflected continuity of purpose. Decisions regarding deployment, reinforcement, and arbitration were informed by accumulated experience. Expansion had become institutional rather than episodic. Military expeditions no longer represented exceptional exertion but integral policy. Authority rested on predictable execution rather than spectacle. By this stage, the shift from defense to consolidation was unmistakable. Walls stood where none had before. Tribute flowed along stabilized corridors. Cavalry patrols moved through territories that had once marked the frontier. Zazzau's reach extended beyond its original boundaries not through sudden upheaval, but through sustained, disciplined pressure. The transformation altered the state's internal rhythms as much as its external posture, embedding expansion into its structure and redefining its place within the regional balance. Amina's campaigns altered more than geography. They recalibrated internal perceptions of leadership and power. Her authority became inseparable from military success, and Zazzau's identity shifted from participant in regional trade to regional force shaping it. What had begun as strategic necessity became structural transformation. The state could no longer return to its earlier posture of cautious equilibrium. In the capital, the change was first visible not in ceremony but in routine. Councils convened with an altered tone, as reports from distant territories carried greater weight than disputes within the walls. Maps marked with newly aligned settlements were consulted alongside grain tallies and tribute records. Authority was no longer measured solely by preservation of stability but by management of expansion. The responsibilities of governance expanded with the borders they now encompassed. Military success had established credibility beyond debate. Officers who had ridden under Amina's command returned season after season with confirmation of her strategic judgment. Their loyalty rested not in rhetoric but in demonstrated consistency. Orders were issued with clear objectives and supported by logistical planning that reduced uncertainty. This predictability strengthened her standing within the court. Authority grew from reliability rather than display. Among administrators, perception shifted in parallel. The flow of tribute from newly incorporated regions increased the resources available to the capital. Investments in fortifications and cavalry maintenance reinforced the cycle of growth. Expansion was no longer an experiment, it had become an operating principle. Officials adjusted their calculations accordingly, aligning personal ambitions with the broader trajectory of the state. Advancement within the hierarchy increasingly depended on competence in managing extended networks of obligation. The physical presence of returning cavalry units reinforced this transformation. Dust-covered riders entering the gates carried visible evidence of distance traversed and objectives secured. Equipment bore marks of sustained use. Horses required careful tending after long campaigns, their flanks streaked with salt from exertion. These tangible signs of effort lent weight to abstract claims of influence. The city's inhabitants could see that authority was being exercised far beyond familiar fields. Diplomatic exchanges reflected the recalibration as well. Envoys from neighboring polities approached Zazzau with altered posture, acknowledging its expanded reach. Negotiations now assumed the state's capacity to project force when necessary. Tribute arrangements were discussed with reference to established precedent rather than speculative intent. Recognition of Zazzau's role in shaping trade routes became embedded in regional dialogue. Within the broader population, adaptation unfolded gradually. Merchants benefited from stabilized corridors and predictable oversight, yet they also navigated new administrative expectations. Taxes were standardized to reflect expanded infrastructure. Caravans moved with increased assurance but under clearer authority. The balance between autonomy and regulation shifted in favor of centralized coordination. Prosperity and oversight advanced together. Psychologically, Amina's position within this evolving structure deepened in complexity. Military success reinforced her legitimacy, yet it also bound her authority to continued effectiveness. The expectations placed upon her were no longer provisional. Sustained expansion had redefined the scope of responsibility. Decisions carried consequences not only for immediate security but for the maintenance of a broadened system. Restraint remained essential, as overextension could unravel gains secured through discipline. Internally, some resistance to this transformation likely persisted among factions accustomed to earlier equilibrium. Expansion imposed new burdens, and the distribution of resources required adjustment. Yet repeated confirmation of strategic soundness diminished overt opposition. Results tempered hesitation. Stability under expanded authority validated the departure from caution. The cumulative effect of these developments was structural rather than episodic. Institutions adapted to manage extended territory. Communication networks strengthened to maintain oversight. Tribute systems were refined to balance extraction with sustainability. The state's identity shifted from guarding access to shaping flow. This shift was not proclaimed in sweeping statements, it was realized through procedure and repetition. By this stage, the notion of returning to a strictly defensive posture had become impractical. The network of aligned territories, fortified corridors, and established tribute agreements formed an interconnected framework. Withdrawal would destabilize revenue, erode credibility, and invite challenge. Expansion had created dependencies that reinforced continuation. The earlier equilibrium, defined by cautious containment, no longer corresponded to reality. Amina's authority thus stood at a threshold defined not by conquest alone but by integration. Her leadership had altered expectations within court and countryside alike. Military capability, administrative coordination, and diplomatic recognition converged into a coherent system. The transformation was embedded in daily governance, in the measured circulation of goods and directives, in the steady presence of cavalry along widened frontiers. What had begun as response to vulnerability matured into redefinition of purpose. Zazzau's posture in the regional balance of power was now active rather than reactive. The turning point lay not in a single campaign but in the collective acknowledgement that the state's identity had changed. Authority rested upon sustained outward engagement, and the structures supporting that engagement had taken root deeply enough to endure. When Amina's reign concluded, the consequences of her expansion endured beyond her lifetime. Trade networks had been reoriented, defensive walls had become symbols of reach, and Zazzau had emerged as a state defined by initiative rather than vulnerability. Her legacy was not merely that of a warrior queen, but of a ruler who altered the trajectory of her kingdom. The transformation she initiated outlived the campaigns that began it. The years following her final campaigns did not immediately signal rupture. Governance continued within structures she had strengthened, and the routines of tribute, patrol, and arbitration persisted with established rhythm. Cavalry units maintained the routes that had once required testing. Fortified settlements required repair and supervision. The machinery of expansion, once experimental, now operated as inherited obligation. Stability, though never absolute, rested on foundations laid through sustained exertion. Within the capital, memory of earlier caution lingered in contrast to present capacity. Older advisors who had witnessed Zazzau's more restrained posture could measure the distance traveled not merely in territory but in expectation. The state's responsibilities had multiplied. Grain levies reflected expanded population under oversight. Diplomatic correspondence referenced corridors that earlier generations would have considered distant. Authority was embedded in practice. The walls constructed during Amina's campaigns stood as visible markers of permanence. Earth shaped by coordinated labor hardened under seasons of sun and rain, bearing silent testimony to intention. These fortifications were maintained not as relics but as functional structures, integrating aligned territories into a coherent network. Travelers moving along secured routes encountered a continuity of presence that reinforced association with the capital. Architecture conveyed political reality. Trade, recalibrated through sustained oversight, flowed along corridors stabilized by predictable enforcement. Merchants adapted to administrative systems standardized during her reign. Taxes were collected with procedural regularity, supporting maintenance of cavalry and infrastructure. Economic integration reinforced political cohesion. The relationship between expansion and prosperity, once tentative, had matured into expectation. For those who had served directly under Amina's command, recollection of her leadership became reference rather than myth. Strategic decisions remembered for their precision informed future planning. Discipline in campaign execution had set a standard. Authority derived from competence, and that standard shaped subsequent rulers' approach to governance. The precedent of measured expansion constrained recklessness while discouraging passivity. Her personal presence receded from daily administration, yet the structures she solidified continued to frame decision-making. The court no longer debated whether outward engagement was prudent, it deliberated how best to sustain it. Withdrawal from established territories would have disrupted revenue, weakened credibility, and invited opportunistic challenge. Expansion had created interdependence between center and periphery that discouraged contraction. Psychologically, the transformation extended beyond institutional mechanics. Zazzau's inhabitants had grown accustomed to identifying their state as guarantor rather than dependent participant. Pride in secured routes and fortified settlements did not require proclamation. It was reflected in the confidence of merchants, in the routine departure of patrols, in the steady cadence of council deliberations addressing matters once considered external. Identity had shifted through repetition. Regional perception also adapted. Neighboring polities calculated policy with acknowledgement of Zazzau's established reach. Diplomatic exchanges incorporated recognition of influence consolidated during Amina's reign. Resistance, when it arose, confronted a state accustomed to coordination across distance. The durability of structures reduced vulnerability to sudden reversal. Time introduced gradual adjustment, as it always does, yet the broad trajectory remained altered. Trade networks continued to favor corridors secured under earlier campaigns. Fortifications required maintenance but did not lose purpose. Tribute relationships evolved, negotiated within frameworks initially formalized through expansion. The system demonstrated resilience beyond the individual who had intensified its formation. Legacy, in this context, resided not in legend but in continuity. Oral traditions preserved memory of campaigns and wars, yet the more enduring testament lay in administrative normalcy. Amina's reign had redefined what Zazzau considered possible. The cautious equilibrium of earlier generations gave way to structured assertion embedded within governance. The shift endured because it had been institutionalized rather than improvised. When viewed across decades, the transformation appears less as dramatic rupture and more as recalibration sustained by discipline. Expansion altered economic flow, political expectation, and regional hierarchy in ways that could not easily be undone. Zazzau's place within the Hausa world had been reconfigured through deliberate accumulation of authority. The campaigns that initiated this process concluded, but the orientation they established persisted, shaping the kingdom's trajectory long after their immediate exertion faded into memory.